So, Sandy, thank you very much indeed for that introduction. And yes, you are a great friend, and you've been working with me really on this journey where we've been looking at that intersection between planning, between nature and health. And the great thing about being a GP still is that every time I see a patient, they are my marketing advisor. So I can find out what will work and what won't work. You know, what stops people from being outdoors and enjoying the outdoors, and what actually stops them from doing it. So I'm going to go through a little bit of the journey that I've been on over the last 30 years. So as I say, I'm a GP, but I've just been fascinated by how nature and how the way we design the place seems to make such a difference on health. So we need to start off really with where we actually are in the beginning. So we were designed to be connected to nature. We are hunter-gatherers, so this disconnection that now coming away from nature and into cities, 54% of the world's population live in cities, is that causing the problem of obesity and other chronic diseases? Is it actually the place that's changed and us being kind of alien to it that is causing all these problems? So that's what we're going to discover over the next 30 minutes or so, and I really would be loving if you could have a lot of questions at the end, because we really need to get to the bottom of this. So we've got a nice environment here. This is a walkable environment. This is a safe environment. People will be very much keen to come here and do the walking. So what is it about this environment here that actually makes people want to be outdoors and walk? Well, we have to go back a long way. We have to go back about 100,000 years. Some would say 200,000 years, which is when we pretty much stopped developing, and we are what we are now was actually what we were like 100 or 200,000 years ago. And all the way through that time, we have been pretty much hunter-gatherers. So let's make it easy for ourselves. If we make an hour equal to 1,000 years, that's 100 hours, and 100 hours is about 4 days. So on the top, you see the 4 days. On the bottom, that's about 100,000 years ago. We go all the way to 10 hours ago. So from 4 days to 10 hours ago, and all that time we were hunter-gatherers, getting better and better at being a hunter-gatherer. And then the agriculture came. So we were still outdoors, we were still connected to nature, we were still active and working in groups, but this time we were no longer nomadic. 4 hours ago, the first civilizations, they're the ones in Egypt, and then we've moved a little bit on to the big change. So all of those blue ones were outdoors, active, connected to nature, connected to each other. Industrialization, which is only 9 minutes ago, was when the car came along and we started to disconnect ourselves from nature and from ourselves. But you know, there's been a bigger revolution that's occurred even more recently, and that's the one at 80 seconds ago. And 80 seconds ago, we got the first problems of total disconnection from nature. And that was basically the technology, the screen age. So let's have a look now and see where we are on this here. So if we go now to the next, get it. So our factory settings are that we're connected to each other, we're connected to place, and we have some purpose. We feel valued. We have a green environment, and we connect with the people around us and feel sociable. What's happened is that with this change, particularly this screen age, is that we've become lonely, we've got a hostile environment, and we have this feeling of rejection, not being valued. So no wonder our bodies react to that. And by reacting to that, they get this kind of chronic stress and this fear. And this chronic stress and fear creates a whole range of things, which I'll go through, and is probably the foundation, I think, of a lot of the problems we have in health at the moment. So let's look at that middle bit, that place, that hostile environment. Actually, nature is pretty good at healing people. It does 4 major things. It creates less stress, it gives us more exercise and activity. A huge part of it is the more social interactions, and of course, when there's nature, there's also less problems of air quality, of poor air quality, noise, heat and wind and all those other things. So nature has benefited, and increasingly over the last 10 years, researchers around the world have realized actually how important that connection to nature is. So let's have a look at a bit of an example here of one of the studies that have been done. So here you can see a kind of streetscape in, I think where it is, but it's pretty horrible. It's not very nice. There's not an ounce of green there at all. It's not a place that you'd really want to walk down. It's not a place you want to stay around for very long. If you put some trees, it starts to improve. It's exactly the same place, but those trees have actually accentuated it and made it a little bit more friendly and a little bit place that you actually do want to stay. So what they did with this study was they divided people into 4 groups. So one group got a whole range of pictures at the top. The other group got a whole range of pictures at the bottom with trees. The third group got the picture at the bottom, but the trees only came up in a subliminal split second. So only for a very, very short time did they actually see the trees. So short that you didn't even see it in your cortex, you saw it in your subliminal, more primitive brain. And the fourth group had somebody talking about those trees. So you saw the trees, but you had someone with you. So let's have a look and see how that affected our brains, because if you did some puzzles and some works on maths at the beginning and at the end, we'd see whether the people at the top who saw just those streetscapes or those at the bottom did better. Well, if we look here, the no trees, the ones at the top, they did worse. They actually performed worse on this mathematical calculations they had to do before and after. Those who saw the trees full on, and those who saw it for just a brief second, both did exactly the same. So that subliminal part shows that the primitive part of our brain is the one that's doing all the work here. And those that had somebody with them explaining about the trees did the best. So here we see that actually connection to the trees actually changed people's brain, and actually the hostile environment actually made our cognition worse. So if we look at areas which have got greenery and they've got trees and have got more nature, in Wisconsin here and Milwaukee, you actually see also less depression, less stress, and that's with tree cover, green space, and the NDVI, which is the satellite version of a normalized difference vegetation index. So we started to see a pattern here that what happens with the connection to nature is actually showing that we're actually beginning to get our brain into a less stressed mode. And even in patients who are pregnant, you can just see on the left here that high blood pressure in pregnant women increased by 14% for every 300 meters away from green space. Studies now being done in Europe confirming this in several parts of Europe. So this nature thing seems to be important, and we have kind of moved away in technology and medicine, well away from medicine. So I mean from nature, and you can go to a hospital and you won't see really any greenery at all, and you go to an intensive care unit in the hospitals and you see a man-made environment which may not be the best. So let's have a look at that in a kind of real-life setting. Now Francis Keogh and Bill Sullivan did some work in the kind of 80s and 90s in these blocks here. These are the Robert Taylor homes in Chicago, all been knocked down now, but they were the kind of state-of-the-art housing development for the Afro-Caribbean groups in Chicago. Very, very poor area. And as those kind of big concrete monoliths kind of aged, in some of them, the trees survived. And you can see on the right where some of them actually are covered, got trees around them and they've got grass and they look quite good. In others, the drainage made sure that the trees died and the grass died and it was just concrete. And they compared the populations in each of those tower blocks with whether they had trees and grass or whether they just had the concrete. And what they showed was that even though someone living on the 5th or 20th floor of one of those tower blocks may not actually be at the ground level and being in connection with the grass and the trees, that those people where the trees and the grass were intact knew more people on the floor. And when they did the studies, what happened was as people walked out of their building on the ground floor, they stopped and talked to each other because there were trees and it was grass, and therefore they felt safe. Where there was concrete, they hustled past each other, not talking, because they felt there was a threat, that stress we saw there. So knowing next door neighbour, knowing people on the floor, unity, cohesion. And I could show you lots of graphs. It did lots of studies. It's worth looking at them if you've got time, because it also showed domestic violence was significantly reduced in those areas where there was a grass and trees. So this is one of the first studies to show that actually if you create an environment which looks less hostile, of less stress, people talk to each other and there's cohesion. And even in children, the stressful events of children can be moderated by trees and grass. This is not the same tower blocks. This is another study, and what it shows is that the children who've had lots of stressful events, that's the low, medium and high, the ones who've obviously got the more stressful events are the high. The psychological stress on the left goes up obviously as that child gets more stressful events through their early life, but you can see where there's low nature, that psychological stress is much higher compared to the high nature. So what happens is it blunts the difference between the groups. In other words, nature looks after the children who've got the greatest stress and cares for them a bit better. It blunts that, that extra worry and stress that those children are having. And this is, we find it all along, the health inequalities is reduced where nature is, and the poorest people do better with nature, and the affluent hardly change at all. This is all coming out in a book, which I'll do a little plug for, Nature and Public Health, the Oxford textbook's the first sort of real major textbook that's coming out, which will show all the differences of how nature can affect public health from authors and professors all around the world. It's a very exciting time now for those people involved with this, because it's really come to its own age now, where after years and years of being in the doldrums. So let's get back to where we were. We've looked at the loneliness, we've looked at this hostile environment now in a bit more detail, and we've looked at that lack of value. And that chronic stress, because we got it all wrong, is creating anxiety, depression. But what it does, it changes our behavior. So now we become less active if you're stressed. If you're stressed, you have poorer diet. If you're stressed, you have more visceral fat in your tummy. If you're stressed, you start smoking, you take drugs, you drink alcohol. So stress creates a kind of immediacy that people need to kind of combat this stress. This immediacy of something to stimulate it out, say the alcohol or smoking, and you're too tired to become active, and you want fat and sugar because that gives you the calories you need. So this is a very much a protective measure that we were designed that if we were under threat, we took as many calories and rested as much as we possibly could in preparation for what's coming around the corner. But this is happening all the time. This chronic stress doesn't stop, it carries on. So what happens then is this chronic stress and these behavior changes we see on the right, and I've put in activities, the major one there, but all of them change, and you get these stress hormones. And these stress hormones and that change of behavior create something which we now know is fundamental to health and disease, and it's called the chronic inflammation. Now inflammation, we know, is you cut yourself or you bruise yourself or you scratch yourself and it goes red and it bleeds and it looks hot, and that's the body all fighting about this this kind of cut or whatever it is. If you get an infection, your temperature goes up. If your temperature goes up, that's part of the inflammation. But we were designed to have a very, very quick elevation of inflammatory markers, and then it would crash down again back to normal after a few weeks. So any infection we got, we should have got better. What's happening now is that people in this state of chronic stress and inactivity and eating poor diet have consistent and constant chronic inflammation. There's no downtime. The immune system is churning away, creating inflammatory markers all around the body, but there's no focal point. It's trying to find where the problem is and it can't. And this chronic inflammation, we now know, is when the immune system is constantly switched on. So what does it do? Well, first of all, you can see it really early in children. So children who are obese, who are stressed, who perhaps are eating wrong things and not doing any exercise, they have already got those markers of chronic inflammation starting. So when we talk about prevention, we're actually not. We're talking about treatment. So that child, we can't see anything different about that child compared to the child next door, but inside the body, this chronic inflammation is starting. And these are all the things that will actually be associated with that chronic inflammation in later life. So the arthritis, the cancers, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, anxiety, depression, obesity, dementia, everything, absolutely everything that we now know is the Western diseases is going up, we now know is an inflammatory basis. The anxiety, depression is really stunning in that the brain, when it becomes inflamed, actually creates anxiety. And when the inflammation goes down, the anxiety disappears. So we need to get people active. And we notice that the nature and the way we build the environment can actually get people more active. And we can go into a lot of detail about how we do that. But I'm just going to quickly go through why activity is probably the most important out of all the things we can do to change a community and to become a healthy community. So first of all, if you're inactive, you increase your visceral fat. Okay, that's the fat just there. That fat, and I'm going to show you some CT scans, I'm not sure if it's going to show up, but you can see here in the middle is all that white stuff, not the outside, but the middle bit, and that's the fat wrapped up around all your organs. This is the pandemic of visceral fat we have. It's highly toxic, it creates lots of inflammation, it causes most of the problems for heart disease, for diabetes, and we just shouldn't have it there. It's there for a purpose. It was designed to be very short-lived for times of when you got famine, and it was concentrated there because it didn't get in the way of running and didn't get in the way of throwing a spear. So you could store your fat there temporarily and then you burn it off, hopefully within a few months, but it was never meant to stay there for any longer than that. Now when it happens when you become active, it's the visceral fat that drops. You can see the orange bars there that plummet compared to the subcutaneous fat that also goes down, but actually a lot less goes down from there. So the fat around the hips and the thighs actually are not dangerous at all. That's okay fat. The visceral fat is a toxic one, and that absolutely gets annihilated by activity more than diet. So that's one way that physical activity can reduce the problems of inflammation. The other is very simple, is that every time you contract your muscles, you release these powerful anti-inflammatories called myokines, and these circulate around the whole body, calming every cell, and they get released from the muscles. So you have to at least 20 minutes of activity, and you'll find that that will actually be a way of calming every cell, including in the brain and everywhere else. You have your own statins, your aspirin, whatever it is, but actually they're in your muscle and they will get released. So that's why the muscles have to be used as well. So resistance training is very important to try and reduce the inflammation through these myokines. And then we're going to come to the nitty-gritty of damaging healthy cells, where the problem of inactivity is really, really felt. So here's a cell, here's a mitochondria, that little green thing there. So a healthy cell is dividing all the time, it's replacing itself, and you don't age. The mitochondria, those little batteries, 35 in every cell, they have to keep moving. And Professor Mike Murphy says, you know, these are the dynamos. If they stop moving, you become ill. And actually, if you add them all together, they're pretty much the weight of a car battery, because there are billions of them in our body. So let's have a look and see what happens if you're sedentary, you're inactive, you've got a high-fat diet, or you've got a diet with too many calories, and you're feeling stressed. Well, what happens is that mitochondria is all charged up now. It's waiting to be used, and you're not doing anything. You've got plenty of fuel. You're inactive, so you're not doing anything, and you've actually quite stressed, so a lot of cortisol flowing around. And what that all does, it means that those electrons leak out of it. They can't cope being held back any longer, and these electrons come out of this charged up mitochondria and they start causing damage. They're called the free radicals, and we know free radicals are bad. That's these electrons, they're leaking out, and you can see they're also hitting the mitochondrial DNA, and some of them go further afield. You get up off your seat, you start walking around, you start doing things, you starve yourself a bit, you have lower calories, and there's less cortisol around, and you find actually the mitochondria is really healthy. You get more antioxidants, you get more mitochondria, you get stronger mitochondria, and actually the cell becomes much healthier in itself. But crucially, those free radicals haven't drifted away. So if we can see what happens to those free radicals, they come out from a mitochondria, they come to the chromosome where they cause havoc. Now, at the end of every chromosome, you can just see those little tips there are called telomeres. Now, the telomeres are the parts of the chromosome that when you divide get shorter and shorter. So the cell will constantly divide and replace itself, which is where you never age. You know, if you carried on always replacing the cells with exactly the same cell, you'd carry on forever and ever and ever, like some of the sea anemones, because they've got really clever things that actually keep them going. Unfortunately, what happens to us is every time we actually divide a cell, one of those telomere bits get chopped off and it gets shorter and shorter until eventually it's so short that telomere can no longer support the cell and it never gets replaced, and that's aging. So we get our skin gets thinner, our liver gets thinner, our brain gets smaller, our hair gets thinner, you know, and we start to wrinkle and age. And that's because cells are not being replaced, because the telomeres have come to their end. These free radicals actually accelerate the shortening of the telomere, so you age more quickly. So the more free radicals come out, the more you'll age more quickly. And the telomerase, which is trying to replace it, is actually reduced. And that's the end of that cell. Senescence means you finished, and that gets lots of inflammation, and that's the end of it. So we've gone right down to the cell, and now we're going to go right back again to where we started. We were hunter-gatherers. We know that our factory settings that we should be sociable, we should be in a kind of supportive environment, and we should feel valued. We've created cities and places where there's loneliness, where there's hostile environment, who people are not talking to each other, who don't want to go out, and we're feeling this rejection. That creates a fear and chronic stress, and that fear and chronic stress causes stress hormones and changes our behavior because we're trying to survive, and that leads to inflammation, mitochondrial damage, and telomere shortening, and that's when we get all the diseases. So as a GP, I'm coming to the bottom here, and that's really kind of really no good. It's too late. I need to go up to the physical activity, promote it. But what's the point of promoting physical activity if you've got chronic stress there, because it's going to totally stop being active? Or what's the point if you're stressed and you're trying to lose weight because all your stress is trying to keep all the fat cells in your visceral stomach and keeping that going? So we have to go back up again to deal with this, and this is where health has to be. It's the planners, it's the people looking after the parks, it's the people doing the voluntary groups, the community groups, it's the people taking the young people and making them feel valued. That's where health is. It's not at the bottom here, which is the damaged goods, really, where I can just mop up the pieces. So health is at the top, disease is at the bottom. I'm a disease man, I'm not a health man. I look after disease as a doctor. So this is where we have to change everything. And look at what would happen. So here is a lot of people who've got diabetes. Okay. So if you look here on the left, you can see this figure of 1. This is cardiovascular risk on the left. And the group here have got less than 3 hours of activity a week and no diabetes. This next group, the big tall blue, is less than 3 hours a week with diabetes. And you can see that there's a 3 times increase, almost 3 times increase in heart disease just because they've got diabetes. But look what happens with these two here. More than 3 hours a week and no diabetes, more than 3 hours a week with diabetes. In other words, you start to completely annihilate all the extra risk just by getting them active. So I don't have to give statins or ACE inhibitors or insulin or metformin or anything to stop all these problems of these heart disease. I just get them active, and I've done it, and I've actually gone backward. You can see here on the left, it was 1 for cardiovascular risk. It's now below 1 just because I've got more active. That's the medicine we should be doing. Children who sit for too long will get brains that become duller. After 20 minutes of walking, you can see the area here in the hippocampus, an area where they do the behavior and learning getting bigger and bigger, so, and more active. So any head teacher who says, hey, we can't afford to have children who are kind of going to school and doing exercise. Let's get them down to do maths and English. Well, they're not going to learn very much if they don't exercise. So physical activity has to be inclusive in the curriculum. So what's gone wrong? Why have we changed things? Why have we got these hostile environments and this loneliness? Well, I'm going to show you 4 generations of one family in Sheffield. So this is a group where Ed is 8 years old on the left at the top with his mum, and he's there with his great-granddad on the right at the bottom. Now the great-granddad, George, at aged 8 in 1919, he could go 6 miles unattended by his parents and have no problems at all. He could actually go around and just find himself anywhere he wanted to go. You then find his dad, his great-granddad, aged 8, 1950, he was able to walk about 1 mile on his own to the woods. His mother, in 1979, was able to go just half a mile to the swimming pool, but she had to be looked after by her parents. And Ed now is only allowed to go 300 yards. And this was a few years ago, and I can tell you now that there are an awful lot of children who can't even go out of their house without being in a car, because parents don't want to let their children out because they're thought of being a bad parent. We have lost 90% of the roaming, according to research, since the 1970s. So 90% of all that extra activity, that exploration, the connection to nature, that social interaction with children away from parents, that's all gone. And this is where we have to now think about where we've gotten so badly wrong and try and change the environment to make that right, because otherwise those inflammation markers will start in those children of 6, and they will be causing a complete catastrophe later on with increased diabetes and obesity, and we can start to measure it straight away. So getting people active needs a real thinking. We used to build leisure centres, we used to build tennis courts and swimming pools, and we still do, and that's good. You know, they help people take part in sport. But there's a tiny proportion, 5%, 5 to 10% of people will be regularly using those facilities. So we create community events, walks, we can do salsa dancing, we can do Pilates, we can do gym-based things, go in the park, doing activities there, outdoor gyms. These are all things that have developed over the last 20 years, and that's great, and we're increasing the numbers of people outdoors. But still, that's isolating activity into little groups of people, and then you go back to your normal sedentary behavior. What we have to do is to create environments where everybody can become an exercise leader. You help your son, you help your daughter. If you're a doctor, you help your patient. If you're a hairdresser, you help your client. If you're a teacher, it's your pupil. So all of us take responsibility of getting the people around us to become active, because the environment is allowing people just to go out of their front door and into an environment where they can walk and where they can take part. And that is really the way we're going to have to solve this problem of inactivity. It's not organized things where we push people out. It's not even creating community groups, although they will definitely help. It's creating a mass movement. And that mass movement has to be part of where the environment changes. So if we look at where we can recruit people, we can recruit them from being GP practices, from workplaces, from schools and community. But the kind of toolkit we've got to deliver are parks, workplaces, streetscapes, home, sport, school, and community. So all of these areas here are what we have to be able to deliver physical activity. Now, we talk about green all the time. I just wanted to put this slide up because we mustn't forget the blue part. Sandy mentioned about the blue gym. So let's have a look at that. This is what people are actually willing to visit. So at the bottom is urban, no nature. And you can see that that's the 3.66 mark. And the top is the coast. People love the coast. But you'll be surprised that actually the urban blue space is 5.96. It's above woodland and it's above urban green space. So water has a major part to play in getting people to feel relaxed, in reducing stress and making people change that hostile environment into one which is more supportive. So it's a combination of grass and trees and plants and shrubs you find in the park and water. because we're hunter-gatherers, we need water. Water shows that we've made it. We're going to be safe. So I have been taken around Vancouver, the Sandy, and what I noticed when she showed me was these strips of land down the streets where the community have taken over looking after. And this is what we have to do. We have to get the community to be allowed to look after their own environment. Because unless we get the community involved, these parks will be empty. These places we build, which we think are so grand, won't be used. This is the Green Gym, which I helped to set up many years ago. And we use these 5 ways to well-being, which in the UK now is being used by lots of councils. So we connect to each other, we're active, we take notice of the world around us, we keep learning, and we kind of carry on. I can't quite see that one. We kind of carry on. And those 5 ways are ways we can actually increase well-being. And that's been taken from religions all around the world, and it was a government organized study. And those 5 ways are used for people to try and look after their own environment, club together, be outdoors, be connected, and we then notice the fruits of nature on our doorstep. And if people do that, they won't think about themselves being active, they just think they're actually doing a good job for the community. But actually this study here, very clever, just showed that people who did the Green Gym, they did it for 3 hours, and you can see that red mark there showing that the cardiovascular rate was going at about 150. So for 3 hours of that work, they were in the cardiovascular training zone. The person who did the step aerobics, well, they did about 20 minutes, and then it drops down quite steeply as they do a kind of cool down. You talk to the 2 people afterwards, or the same person afterwards, and this is done in a study, and they asked them, what do you do in the Green Gym? And they said, well, it's fantastic. I looked at, I went to this river, we looked at this bed here. We had to actually change the bank so that the water voles can get in there. And we got all these plants sorted out for the butterflies. And I met this lovely person, and we're going to go and go for walks together. And we had some tea, and then we had some cake. And it was just a really, really good morning. Not a thing about physical activity, but that person's done 3 hours in the cardiovascular training zone. Talk about step aerobics, and it's all about physical activity. It's all about the glutes and the quads and the pecs and all of the muscles and the toning and everything else like that. But that was only 20 minutes in the cardiovascular training zone. In other words, this is health by stealth, where the end point for that person who did the Green Gym was something of much higher value. It was a connection to nature. It was a connection to the people around. It was a value, feeling valued, that people, purpose, place. Whereas in the step aerobics, it was really tight, very small bandwidth, and physical activity was the end point, and that's not sustainable. So I'd just like to end on a project we've been doing now, which is part of Intelligent Health, which is a company I set up 10 years ago to try and shake the way we did things. I just felt we weren't getting it right. We needed to move at a grander scale. So we use that principle of using physical activity as a means to the end and not the end in itself. So if you look here, you can see a little beat box on the left attached to a lamppost, and you can see these excited children, and they've all got cards, and they're trying to go to that beat box, and they'll go to another one a bit further, about half a mile away, and they'll link them together, and they'll get 10 points for their team, and their team's a school, and that school will go up the leaderboard a bit more. And the more they swipe these beat boxes, the more the schools go up the leaderboard. And we go in to a city, so like Belfast or London or Vienna, where we're in at the moment, and we will go and actually talk to the schools, the businesses, the community organisations, get all the community groups together. And we will say, look, here's a game coming, it's only going to be for 7 weeks, here are all your cards, and we send thousands and thousands of cards out, and we get the children to all get excited about their primary school, elementary school taking part, and then they start to join a program, and then on the first day they go out and they go to all these lampposts with their parents, grandparents, aunts and uncles, and they go and join them all up, and they start to understand where they live. They start to see the parks and the green spaces and the water and the canals and the rivers and the trees, and they start to understand that actually they live in a lovely place. And even the streets, the urban streets, have got trees and places where they can actually walk. And they walk and they walk and they run and they cycle. and we get figures of up to 400 to 500,000 points coming through, or swipes, where over 500,000 swipes. In East Sussex, 42,000 people started taking part just in a couple of weeks, and we've been often getting figures of up to 25%, even 38% of the population playing. In the big cities it's a bit lower, but this is a mass participation, and what we're doing is connecting people together and connecting them to their place. We stop it at 7 weeks because at that point we don't want this game to be the incentive. We want them to carry on doing their own thing. So here's in East Sussex, 42,000. Each of these are a beatbox. Each beatbox has got a circle which shows the big ones have been used a lot. And here is now health being seen as a map. And all of those little beatboxes are all being working to get people to become more active in those cities and those towns. 750,000 people have now taken part in just the last 3 years. So I'm just going to show this, just to be able to show you what it looks like when you've got a town taking part in Beat the Street. Oh, it's not going to do that. Let's see if it does that again. So if it shows, it's going to show it or not. So you can just see if this is 5 o'clock in the morning, 6 o'clock in the morning. These are all the beatboxes now. This is school time. Now you can see them all crashing around a place, all going around between each of the beatboxes with their cards. And this is now in the afternoon. I mean, it's the school time again. And this is the whole town. This is a 38% of the population were taking part in this in just a few weeks. And it changed activities for good. So even a year later, we held on to those gains that we made because people are now walking to school, they're walking to work, they're taking their children to the park, they were connecting to the place. So we create the great place, but then you need that behavior change to get people to use it. So what we found was when we started, it was about prizes, and everyone was excited about the prizes, but very quickly the prizes became unimportant, and the top one became exploring a local area. There's that connection to place, getting fit, having fun, and spending time with friends and family, which is the purpose, and people feeling more healthy. And then right at the bottom at the end was winning prizes. In other words, that disappeared. It was all about the local area of people starting to get that sense of purpose and feeling connected to place. So this little chap here is our best marketeer, because he will get his dad, his granddad, his aunt, his uncle, and who's going to stop this little chap from doing his sweet, touching the beatboxes from here to there? Someone will go with them. So we want the children to bring the parents out for the walks, and that's what we're finding. If we do a return on investment, this is using pounds, but it could be dollars, it's the same ratio. Over 2 years, you can just see that for productivity, for every pound spent or every dollar spent, there's 12 pounds or dollars back. In healthcare, it's $19 or pounds back. And that's because we're shifting so many people, 10% of the population shift into activity, that actually that has a major impact on all the diseases. And in productivity, it's actually keeping people at work. The absenteeism goes down, and transport, it's less congestion because you've got more people now going out of their cars. And here just shows that people who took part in both years, which is the black line, 36% to 45% of people reaching the government target of 150 minutes a week. The next year, when those same people registered, there was 46%, so they hadn't dropped at all, and it went up 56% at the next game. And new people coming in, they went from 40% to 47%. So we can change behaviours in cities. It's possible to do that, but we need both. We need the environment to be changed so that there's nature, there's a lack of hostility in that environment, so people feel supported. And then we need people to go out and actually explore it and feel it belongs to them. Get them to build it, get them to plan it, get them to initiate the new areas there. So, the story. We're designed to be hunter-gatherers. Sorry guys, but that's what we are. We're not kind of new fad 21st century creatures. We're still locked back into the 100,000 years of being a hunter-gatherer. That's what our mitochondria talk about. That's what our genetics is. That's what every metabolic part of our body is geared to be, a hunter-gatherer. And we're not going to change that in the next 500 to 1,000 years. So this disconnection from nature is causing us chronic stress. We eat badly because we're trying to conserve energy to this stress, which we don't understand. We exercise less. That creates this more visceral fat, inflammation, telomere shortening, all those nasty things that go on deep inside our body. And that's the result of chronic disease and diabetes and anxiety, depression, heart disease. So being healthy is not about taking metformin or insulin. It's not about diets, etc. It's about friends. It's about nature. It's about feeling good about ourselves. It's about family. And nature helps to reduce the stress. It connects people together, increases activity, and actually makes us generally more healthy. And if we're going to change an urban environment, it's actually a very simple rule. It's creating a supportive environment where people do it for themselves, where people feel they're connected back again to this part where they feel comfortable with nature, with water and trees and grass, and then the rest will follow. Thanks very much.